Hey, this is Bunny. Today we're painting a fantasy tree, but I also thought this would be the perfect opportunity to talk about something that doesn't always get the attention it deserves in tabletop gaming: terrain. Specifically, why terrain matters so much in Dungeons & Dragons. Because if you've spent any amount of time painting miniatures, you've probably discovered something interesting. Heroes get all the glory. Dragons get all the excitement. Wizards throw fireballs, rogues steal everything that isn't nailed down, and quite a few things that are, and yet somehow it's often the humble tree, the ruined wall, the stone bridge, or the moss-covered boulder that quietly turns an ordinary encounter into one that players are going to remember years later. So while we bring this little tree to life, let's talk about why scenery deserves a little more love than it sometimes gets. When people first get into miniature painting, it's easy to assume the miniatures themselves are the whole hobby. You buy a fighter, a dragon, maybe a beholder because, well, it's a beholder. How could you not? You paint your heroes, your villains, your monsters, and before long you've got shelves filled with incredible characters. Then game night arrives, everyone places their beautifully painted miniatures onto a dry erase grid with "tree" written in marker inside a sad little green blob. We've all been there. Somewhere, that lovingly painted druid miniature is standing beside what looks suspiciously like a radioactive broccoli floret drawn by someone holding the marker in their non-dominant hand. Now, don't misunderstand me. There's absolutely nothing wrong with simple maps or theater of the mind. Some of the greatest D&D sessions I've ever experienced involved almost no physical components whatsoever. Great storytelling will always beat expensive accessories. If you have an amazing dungeon master who can paint vivid pictures with words, players will happily imagine towering castles, twisting forests, and terrifying caverns without a single physical prop on the table. Dungeons & Dragons has survived for decades because imagination is the most powerful game piece any group can own. Terrain doesn't replace imagination. It supports it. That's an important distinction because sometimes people see these elaborate gaming tables online and think they've somehow been playing D&D incorrectly. Suddenly there are handcrafted castles, individually sculpted cobblestones, waterfalls made from resin, flickering LED fireplaces, smoke effects, and enough terrain to make a small museum jealous. Meanwhile, you're sitting there with a stack of hardcover books, balancing a piece of cardboard that says "Bridge," wondering if you've failed as both a gamer and a human being. I promise you haven't. Fancy terrain doesn't make a campaign better any more than owning 12 frying pans automatically makes someone a better cook. It just gives you more tools to work with. Think about your favorite movie. Imagine if every scene happened inside the exact same empty room with white walls. The dialogue still might be brilliant. The acting could still be incredible. But eventually, you'd start wondering if everyone in this world rented the same apartment. Setting matters because setting tells part of the story before anyone even speaks. A lonely mountain feels different from a bustling marketplace. A haunted swamp creates a completely different mood than a peaceful meadow. We instinctively understand these places because our brains are wired to associate environments with emotion. That's true in movies and books and video games and absolutely in tabletop role-playing games. Terrain is really environmental storytelling. Every rock, every broken pillar, every abandoned wagon, every twisted tree can quietly answer questions about the world without anyone stopping to explain it. Why is there a ruined watchtower in the middle of the forest? Who built it? Why was it abandoned? Why are the stones blackened as though they survived a terrible fire? Players love asking these questions because curiosity is one of the engines that drives exploration. Good terrain doesn't just decorate the battlefield. It invites players to wonder what happened here long before they arrived. One of my favorite things about fantasy settings is that they don't have to obey reality all of the time. Sure, you can build an ordinary oak tree if that's what your adventure needs. But maybe this forest grows silver bark that glows under moonlight. Maybe the branches slowly shift position whenever nobody is watching. Maybe every autumn the leaves fall upward instead of down. Fantasy gives us permission to ask, what if? Over and over and over again. Terrain becomes another opportunity to answer that question in interesting ways without saying a single word. And here's where painting terrain becomes surprisingly satisfying. Characters have expectations. If you paint a dragon, people know what a dragon should roughly look like. If you paint a knight, somebody is going to have opinions about the armor. Trees? Trees are wonderfully forgiving. They twist differently. They grow strangely. They lean toward the light, away from the wind, over rivers, around rocks, through ruins. Nature doesn't read instruction manuals. It just decides one day, you know what? I'm going sideways now. And somehow it still looks completely believable. Honestly, trees are the rogues of the plant kingdom. They refuse to follow the rules and somehow make everyone else think that that was the plan all along. As I'm painting this little tree, I'm not just thinking about bark colors or leaf highlights. I'm imagining where this tree lives. Is it part of an ancient druid grove where generations of adventurers have sought wisdom? Does it stand beside an old road that merchants have traveled for centuries? Has a mischievous fairy claimed the hollow beneath its roots? Could a goblin scout be hiding behind it while the party confidently insists they've checked for ambushes? Because let's be honest, no D&D player has ever confidently declared, "I'm absolutely certain nothing dangerous is behind that tree," and immediately regretted those words. The universe simply doesn't allow for it. That's really what today's conversation is about. Terrain isn't just scenery. It's another character in your campaign. Sometimes it's welcoming, sometimes it's mysterious, sometimes it tries very hard to kill you, usually by convincing the wizard that climbing a suspicious cliff during a thunderstorm is an excellent idea. Every hill, forest, bridge, ruin, cave, and winding trail has the potential to shape the adventure in ways that monsters alone never could. So while this weathered old tree slowly comes to life under a few layers of paint, let's spend some quality time exploring the many ways terrain quietly transforms an ordinary game of Dungeons & Dragons into something truly unforgettable. Theater of the mind is where many of us begin. Maybe you're sitting around a kitchen table with a few pencils, some character sheets, and enough snacks to sustain a small village. The dungeon master describes a dark forest. You imagine it. They describe a ruined temple. You imagine that too. Combat starts. Everyone closes their eyes for a half second, and suddenly there's a vivid battlefield living entirely inside your collective imagination. It's elegant, inexpensive, and incredibly powerful. It's also the reason you'll occasionally hear someone ask, "Wait, I thought the troll was over there." No, Steve, the troll has never been over there. Steve has simply wandered into another dimension of spatial awareness. Theater of the mind shines because it removes almost every limitation. The Dungeon Master doesn't have to own anything. Players don't need elaborate terrain collections or beautifully painted miniatures. A battlefield can stretch for miles, castles can crumble dramatically, and dragons can circle overhead without anyone worrying about whether there's enough table space. It's storytelling in its purest form. In fact, some encounters actually work better this way. Massive naval battles, enormous armies clashing across valleys, or frantic escapes through collapsing cities can sometimes feel more cinematic when imagination isn't confined by physical objects. But as wonderful as theater of the mind can be, it occasionally asks our brains to juggle a surprising amount of information. You're trying to remember where everyone is standing, which goblin is injured, whether the bridge was 20 feet long or 40 feet long, if the wizard is close enough to cast a spell without roasting the fighter, and whether that suspicious statue was beside the door or beside the staircase. Before long, your imagination has opened approximately 14 browser tabs, forgotten why it opened half of them, and somehow started playing music from somewhere. Human brains are amazing, but they're also easily distracted by imaginary goblins. That's where maps begin to help. Even the simplest battle map provides a shared understanding of space. Suddenly, everyone can see where the river runs, where the walls stand, and how far away that angry ogre actually is. Arguments become shorter because instead of debating what everyone remembers, the distance is sitting right there on the table. Distance becomes visible. Position matters. Movement feels more meaningful because players can actually see the consequences of every decision. Sometimes clarity is every bit as valuable as creativity. Battle maps also encourage tactical thinking. A fighter starts looking for choke points instead of charging straight ahead. The ranger notices a good firing position on higher ground. The rogue begins measuring exactly how many crates they can hide behind before inevitably attempting something the dungeon master didn't quite anticipate. Which, to be fair, is usually somewhere between creative and completely unhinged. If you've ever watched a rogue spend 10 minutes developing an elaborate infiltration plan, only to immediately abandon it because someone failed a stealth check, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Then we arrive at three-dimensional terrain, and something fascinating happens. Suddenly the battlefield isn't just something you're looking at, it's something you're exploring. A ruined tower actually rises above the table. A bridge spans an actual river. Trees block sightlines. Hills have genuine height. Even before combat begins, players start leaning forward. Their hands hover over miniatures. They begin pointing at locations and asking questions. Can I climb that? Can I hide behind this? What's inside that building over there? Physical terrain naturally invites interaction because our brains instinctively treat real objects differently than flat drawings. One of my favorite things to watch is the moment someone forgets they're looking at painted foam, plastic, resin, or wood. It happens all the time. They'll pick up their miniature, slowly move it around a ruined wall, peek behind a tower, or physically lean down to see what another character can see. They're no longer thinking about terrain as a game accessory. They've accepted it as part of the world. That's an incredible compliment to the person who built or painted it. If your scenery helps people forget they're sitting around a dining room table, even for a few moments, you've created something pretty special. Of course, there's a danger here too. It's easy to fall into the trap of believing every encounter needs an enormous display worthy of a convention. Social media is wonderful for inspiration, but it also has a sneaky habit of convincing us that everyone else owns a medieval city and 3 volcanoes and 6 castles and approximately 900 trees. Meanwhile, you're looking at your own collection thinking, well, I have this one barrel. First of all, that barrel is doing its absolute best, okay? It's trying. Second, comparison is the fastest way to convince yourself a perfectly good game somehow isn't good enough. In reality, a single thoughtfully placed piece of terrain often creates more memorable moments than an overcrowded table. Imagine one enormous ancient tree standing alone in the middle of a clearing. Instantly, it becomes important. Players wonder why it's there. They'll climb it, hide behind it, tie ropes to it, carve initials into it, apologize to it after discovering it's secretly sentient. Typical D&D behavior. The fewer remarkable objects you place on the table, the more attention each one receives. Sometimes restraint creates stronger storytelling than abundance. That's actually one of the reasons I enjoy painting terrain so much. Every individual piece has the potential to appear in dozens of adventures. The little tree I'm painting today might provide cover for frightened villagers in one campaign, mark the entrance to an ancient druid sanctuary in another, or become the unfortunate object a wizard accidentally sets on fire because apparently I cast fireball remains the universal solution to every conceivable problem. Somewhere there's a dungeon master quietly placing a beautifully handcrafted forest onto the table while muttering, "Please don't burn all of it to the ground in the first round." And somewhere across that table, a player is already calculating the blast radius. Cover is one of those mechanisms that seems incredibly straightforward until you actually put physical terrain on the table. On paper, it's just a bonus to your defenses. In practice, it's one of the reasons battlefields become interesting instead of feeling like two groups politely standing in an empty parking lot, taking turns hitting each other. Suddenly, that fallen log matters. That ruined wall matters. Even a stack of crates becomes strategically valuable. Instead of asking, who do I attack? Players begin asking, where should I stand? Position becomes part of the puzzle, and every movement starts to carry weight. One of the funniest things about D&D players is how quickly they become tactical geniuses the moment they actually see the scenery. Place 2 miniatures on an empty grid and people march forward with the confidence of heroes in an action movie. Add 3 trees, a ruined tower, and a lone stone wall, and suddenly everyone develops the cautious instincts of a squirrel crossing a busy road. Can I get behind this? Does this count as cover? Can they see me through those branches? It's amazing how a couple of painted obstacles can convince even the bravest barbarian that perhaps charging directly into 20 goblins isn't the optimal strategy today. Line of sight is another mechanic that becomes much easier to understand with physical terrain. Reading a rule is one thing. Looking across an actual battlefield and realizing, ew, the wizard literally can't see that target is something else entirely. Players begin thinking about angles instead of just distances. Archers reposition to find clear shots. Spellcasters look for openings between ruined columns. Enemies disappear behind buildings, forcing the party to move instead of just standing still. Combat starts feeling less like a math problem and more like a living environment where visibility constantly changes. Elevation might be one of my favorite terrain elements because it changes the battlefield vertically instead of just horizontally. Cliffs and staircases, rooftops and hills, balconies, fallen trees, and watchtowers all encourage players to think in 3 dimensions. Suddenly, the battlefield has layers. That goblin archer perched on a crumbling wall isn't just farther away, he's harder to reach. Meanwhile, the fighter is wondering whether they can climb that wall, the wizard is considering magical solutions, and the rogue has already announced, I think I can make that jump. No one has checked whether they actually can. Confidence arrives much faster than athletics proficiency. Then there are bottlenecks, and every dungeon master knows how dramatically that can change an encounter. A narrow bridge over a rushing river feels completely different from an open meadow. A single doorway can hold back an army if defended properly. Tight cave passages make area of effect spells both wonderfully effective and mildly terrifying, depending on which side you're standing on. Sometimes the terrain becomes the strongest combatant on the battlefield. The monsters don't have to be particularly clever if the environment is already working in their favor. Of course, difficult terrain deserves a mention because it quietly changes decision-making in some fascinating ways. Mud, deep snow, tangled roots, loose rock, shallow water, thick undergrowth, broken furniture, collapsed masonry. None of these things are particularly glamorous, but they all ask players the same question. Is getting there really worth the effort? Suddenly, movement isn't automatic anymore. Every square has a cost. Every shortcut might actually take longer. Every detour has consequences. It's amazing how quickly adventurers who willingly fight dragons become deeply offended by ankle-high swamp water. One thing I really appreciate about terrain is that it gives every character class opportunities to shine. The rogue has places to hide. Rangers feel at home navigating natural environments. Fighters can hold choke points. Monks leap across rooftops because apparently gravity is more of a polite suggestion than an actual rule. Druids interact with forests in ways nobody else can. Even bards somehow manage to turn an abandoned fountain into a perfect stage for an inspirational speech before combat. Good terrain doesn't favor one character. It gives everyone interesting decisions to make. Environmental hazards take things one step further because now the battlefield actively fights back. Maybe the floor is collapsing beneath everyone's feet. Perhaps lava slowly spreads through the chamber. A frozen lake begins cracking under heavy footsteps. Ancient statues topple during combat. Poisonous vines creep across forgotten ruins. None of these hazards care whether you're a hero or a villain. They're equal opportunity troublemakers. Some of the most memorable encounters aren't memorable because the monster was especially powerful. They're memorable because everyone spent half the battle desperately trying not to fall into something rather unpleasant. As someone who enjoys painting scenery, I love thinking about these possibilities while I'm holding a paintbrush. This little tree isn't just decoration. Maybe it's the only sturdy thing left standing after an ancient battlefield has crumbled away. Maybe its roots conceal a hidden entrance. Maybe it's sacred, and damaging it awakens an angry forest spirit. Maybe it's completely ordinary, and the players spend 45 minutes investigating it because you've unintentionally trained them to believe every tree contains a secret. Dungeon masters know this phenomenon quite well. If you describe a single cabbage with too much enthusiasm, someone's going to roll investigation. Ultimately, terrain transforms combat from a contest of statistics into a contest of creativity. Players stop thinking about what abilities appear on their character sheets and start asking what they can do with the world around them. Can they topple that old statue? cut the bridge, swing from the chandelier, climb that tree, roll the wagon downhill. Suddenly, the environment becomes another tool for the party's arsenal, and encounters become stories people retell long after their campaign has ended. In my opinion, that's exactly what great terrain should accomplish. It doesn't steal the spotlight from the heroes. It gives them a more interesting stage on which to become legendary. Terrain isn't just about making combat more interesting either. In many ways, it's one of the most effective storytelling tools a dungeon master has. Before a single word of dialogue is spoken, before an NPC introduces themselves, before the players even know what quest they're on, the environment is already communicating with them. A village with neat gardens and freshly painted fences and children playing in the streets tells a very different story than one with boarded windows, abandoned carts, and smoke drifting from burned-out buildings. Neither location has said a word, yet your players are already making assumptions. And usually they're making the right ones. That's one of the things I love most about world building. Every place has a history, even if the players never learn every detail. Why is there a broken statue in the town square? Why is half the castle collapsed while the other half remains pristine? Why does this forest have dozens of moss-covered stone markers scattered between the trees? Good terrain hints at stories rather than explaining them outright. Players are naturally curious creatures. Present them with something unusual, and they'll immediately begin inventing theories. Sometimes their theories are better than what you originally planned. Dungeon masters have been quietly stealing player ideas for decades. It's practically an unofficial class feature. Ruins are probably my favorite example of environmental storytelling because they immediately raise questions. Somebody built this place. Somebody lived here. Somebody cared enough to carve decorations into the stone, construct towers, or lay beautiful mosaic floors. So what happened? Was there a war? A plague? A magical disaster? Did the kingdom simply move on? Players don't need a 20-page history lesson to feel the weight of those questions. A few broken walls, some cracked columns, and a weathered staircase leading absolutely nowhere can spark the imagination far more effectively than an encyclopedia ever could. Forests work much the same way, but they're wonderfully flexible. Not every fantasy forest should be identical. Some should feel peaceful, filled with birdsong and filtered sunlight, where travelers might happily stop for lunch. Others should make the party instinctively lower their voices. Dense undergrowth and twisted roots and strangely colored mushrooms and trees growing at impossible angles all create different moods. It's remarkable how much atmosphere you can build simply by changing the shape and arrangement of trees. Nature has an incredible vocabulary, if we pay attention to it. That's one of the reasons I enjoy painting trees so much. At first glance, they're just, well, trees. But the moment you place them on a battlefield, they become so much more. This particular tree could stand beside an old trade road, silently watching generations of travelers come and go. It could mark the edge of an ancient kingdom whose borders have long since disappeared. It could even be completely ordinary. And honestly, ordinary isn't a bad thing. Not every piece of terrain needs to conceal a dragon, a lich, or a portal to another dimension. Sometimes a tree is simply a tree, and that's perfectly okay. Although your players will almost certainly spend 20 minutes convincing themselves otherwise, but that's a them problem, which will shortly be a you problem. Speaking of players, have you noticed how suspicious they become the moment you describe anything in detail? You mention a tree and someone asks if it's magical. You describe an abandoned wagon, and suddenly everyone wants to search every wheel spoke for hidden treasure. Mention a well in the village square, and half the party is preparing to climb inside. Meanwhile, the dungeon master is sitting there thinking, "Friends, I just wanted you to know that there was a well." Players have a remarkable talent for turning harmless scenery into the centerpiece of an unexpected side quest. Honestly, I think they kind of deserve an award for it, especially when I'm the one doing it. Terrain also helps distinguish one location from another. If every dungeon is made of gray stone corridors, eventually they begin to blur together in memory. Perhaps one dungeon has roots bursting through the walls because an ancient forest slowly reclaimed it. Another has polished marble floors that still gleam despite centuries of abandonment. Another has glowing crystals illuminating every chamber in soft blue light. Suddenly, those locations become memorable because they each possess their own identity. Players may forget the name of dungeon number 7, but they'll absolutely remember the crystal cave or the temple with the giant roots. Weather can become a part of terrain too, even though we don't always think of it that way. Rain transforms dirt roads into mud. Snow buries landmarks and muffles sounds. Thick fog limits visibility. Strong winds make narrow bridges far more intimidating. None of these effects require complicated mechanics to have an impact on how players experience the world. Sometimes simply describing leaves blowing across an abandoned courtyard or distant thunder echoing through the mountains is enough to make a place feel alive. The environment becomes dynamic instead of static, and that's something players notice even when they don't consciously realize why. One of my favorite compliments a dungeon master can receive isn't "the combat was really balanced," or even "the villain was really interesting." It's when a player says something like, "I loved exploring that place." Exploration is one of the pillars of Dungeons & Dragons, yet it sometimes gets overshadowed by combat and role-playing. Great terrain encourages exploration naturally. Players want to climb the tower because it's there. They want to cross the bridge because they can see something interesting on the other side. They want to investigate the strange grove because it feels different from everything around it. Curiosity becomes its own reward. And that's really the heart of environmental storytelling. Terrain isn't there simply to fill empty table space. It's there to make the world feel lived in, to suggest stories beyond the current adventure, and to invite players to engage with the setting instead of merely passing through it. Every painted tree, every ruined wall, every winding path, every forgotten shrine, and every lonely hill has the potential to become part of someone's favorite campaign memory. As miniature painters, we're not just creating scenery, we're building places where adventures can happen, where stories can unfold, and where, if we're especially lucky, a group of players will eventually spend 45 completely unplanned minutes arguing over whether that perfectly innocent tree is secretly a mimic. Because with D&D players, you can never rule that possibility out. One of the reasons terrain is so much fun to work with is because fantasy gives us permission to be wildly creative. Real forests are beautiful, but fantasy forests can be absolutely unforgettable. Maybe the trees have brilliant blue leaves that shimmer in moonlight. Perhaps the bark looks like polished silver, or the roots weave themselves into natural archways over ancient roads. Maybe the forest is so old that every tree has slowly grown around abandoned statues from a civilization nobody remembers anymore. The goal isn't to make everything strange for the sake of it just being strange. It's to create places that players instantly recognize as unique. If someone leaves your table saying, "Remember that glowing forest?" you've already won. Of course, not every adventure takes place in the woods. Mountains bring an entirely different kind of storytelling. Cliffs create dangerous paths where one wrong step can send someone tumbling hundreds of feet. Narrow ledges make every encounter feel tense before initiative is even rolled. Caves twist beneath the earth, forcing players to wonder what might be waiting around the next corner. And then there are snow-covered passes where visibility drops, supplies run low, and suddenly the environment itself feels like one more monster trying to stop the party. Sometimes Mother Nature rolls higher initiative than the dragon you're supposed to be fighting. Swamps deserve far more attention than they usually get as well. They're wonderfully unpleasant in all the right ways. Thick mud slows movement. Pools of water hide who knows what beneath the surface. Insects buzz constantly, and every step produces that unmistakable squelching noise that makes everyone instinctively wrinkle their nose. Fantasy swamps can also be strangely beautiful. Massive cypress trees draped in moss, glowing fungi, mysterious lights dancing across the water, and ancient ruins slowly sinking into the muck all create an atmosphere that's equal parts fascinating and unsettling. Players usually walk into swamps expecting monsters. Sometimes the swamp itself does most of the work. Then there are deserts, which are surprisingly underused in a lot of campaigns. A desert doesn't have to be endless empty sand. It can feature towering rock formations, forgotten temples buried beneath shifting dunes, dry riverbeds, scattered oases, ancient roads disappearing into the horizon, and winds that erase footprints almost as quickly as they're made. Visibility stretches for miles, making distant landmarks feel both tantalizingly close and frustratingly unreachable. If forests are about concealment, deserts are often about exposure. There are very few places to hide when the nearest tree is approximately 3 kingdoms away. Cities offer a completely different kind of terrain, because now the battlefield is full of choices. Narrow alleys, crowded marketplaces, rooftops connected by wooden walkways, balconies overlooking busy streets, and fountains and statues and taverns and stables and warehouses and towering clock towers all create opportunities for memorable encounters. Urban terrain encourages movement in every direction. Rogues start climbing buildings, guards block intersections, merchants panic, and somehow, someone always decides that now is the perfect time to commandeer a vegetable cart. I don't know why vegetables are so frequently involved in fantasy chases, but apparently cabbages have accepted their destiny. It's weird, and it continues to happen. Ruined castles might be one of the most iconic fantasy locations ever created, and for good reason. They're practically begging players to explore them. Crumbling staircases disappear into darkness. Towers lean at impossible angles. Ivy covers shattered walls while forgotten banners rock quietly in empty halls. Every room hints at former grandeur. Somewhere there was once a banquet. Somewhere musicians performed. Somewhere soldiers stood watch. Now only echoes remain. It's difficult not to imagine the stories those walls could tell. Even before the first skeleton crawls out of a crypt, the setting already feels alive with history. Magical locations are where miniature painters really let their imaginations run wild. Floating islands connected by waterfalls. Crystal forests reflecting impossible colors. Giant mushrooms taller than castles. Rivers flowing with glowing water beneath permanently star-filled skies. Trees whose branches weave together into natural cathedrals. Fields where flowers bloom differently every sunrise. None of these places need complicated explanations. They're fantasy. They're allowed to simply exist because magic has shaped the landscape in ways our own world never could. Honestly, sometimes it's refreshing to stop asking, would this happen? And instead ask, would this be amazing? As painters, we get to bring those places into the physical world one piece at a time. Maybe today it's a tree. Maybe next week it's a ruined fountain, then a stone bridge, a crumbling tower, or a mysterious standing stone covered in ancient runes. Eventually, you look across your collection and realize you've accidentally built an entire kingdom. That's one of my favorite parts of this hobby. Individual terrain pieces might seem modest on their own, but together they become a library of adventures waiting to happen. Every new project expands the possibilities for future game nights. The wonderful thing is that none of this has to happen overnight. Every experienced terrain builder has started somewhere, usually with one small piece that wasn't quite perfect. Maybe the paint was a little rough. Maybe the flocking wasn't quite what they imagined. Maybe the dry brushing got slightly enthusiastic. We've all been there. The important thing is that every project teaches you something. Every tree you paint makes the next tree better. Every ruined wall helps improve your stonework. Every patch of grass helps you understand color and texture just a little bit more. Progress in miniature painting isn't measured by perfection. It's measured by looking back 6 months and realizing you've quietly become a much better artist without even noticing. One thing I've learned over the years is that good terrain doesn't have to be expensive. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions people have when they first discovered this side of the hobby. They see incredible gaming tables online and immediately assume they need a dedicated workshop, a garage full of tools, and the budget of a small kingdom. In reality, some of the most effective terrain pieces I've ever seen were made from inexpensive materials, recycled packaging, bits of foam, craft supplies, and a healthy willingness to experiment. Miniature painting is one of those hobbies where creativity often matters far more than your shopping list. Your imagination doesn't know whether that stone wall started life as insulation foam or something fancier. In fact, limitations can actually make you a better builder. If you only own a handful of terrain pieces, you'll naturally think about how to use them in different ways. That single tree might become part of an enchanted forest one week, a roadside landmark the next, and the centerpiece of an ancient battlefield after that. Rearranging the same pieces can create entirely different stories. That's something dungeon masters have been doing forever. Players rarely remember that they saw the same ruined wall 3 adventures ago. They're too busy trying to determine whether this ruined wall contains treasure, danger, or somehow both simultaneously. Usually it's both. I also think it's important to remember that terrain exists to serve the game, not the other way around. It's easy to become so focused on building beautiful scenery that we accidentally create battlefields which are difficult to play on. Miniatures need room to stand. Players need to reach across the table without accidentally flattening an entire forest with their sleeve. Important areas should be visible from multiple angles. The prettiest battlefield in the world loses a little of its charm if every other turn begins with someone apologizing because they accidentally knocked over 3 trees and a watchtower and what was until moments ago an extremely intimidating dragon. Guys, tie up your sleeves if there's a lot of stuff on the table. I'm just saying. There's also something wonderfully satisfying about watching a collection grow over time. You don't need to build an entire kingdom this month. Paint one tree, then another. Maybe next week it's a stone bridge, or a ruined pillar, or a campsite, a well. Before long, you realize you've accumulated enough pieces to build half a dozen unique encounters. That's one of my favorite things about terrain. Unlike many hobbies, every project continues to have value years later. The tree I'm painting today could still be appearing in games a decade from now. Hopefully by then it won't have been accidentally set on fire quite as many times, but I'm not making any promises. Poor tree. They always end up on fire. Now don't be afraid to experiment. Some of my favorite paint jobs have happened because I tried something without knowing exactly how it would turn out. Sometimes it works beautifully. Sometimes, well, let's just say the paint stripper gets a surprise guest appearance. Every painter has projects they're proud of and projects they'd rather quietly hide behind the bookshelf. That's completely normal. Improvement comes from doing, not from waiting until you're somehow magically good enough to begin. If that were the requirement, none of us would ever paint our first miniature. The same thing applies to dungeon masters. You don't need to wait until you own an entire handcrafted city before introducing terrain into your game. Start small. Add one interesting feature into an encounter. Maybe it's a bridge, or maybe it's a wagon. Maybe it's a single old tree standing in the middle of a clearing. Give players something they can interact with, besides monsters. You'll probably be surprised how quickly they start using the environment in creative ways. Sometimes they'll completely ignore the carefully planned villain because they've collectively decided the abandoned windmill deserves a full-scale investigation. That's D&D in a nutshell. The players always have their own priorities. It can be annoying and hilarious all at the same time. One thing I really appreciate about terrain is how collaborative it becomes. As painters, we build the scenery. As dungeon masters, we place it into the world. But it's the players who ultimately give it meaning. That old tree isn't memorable because I painted it. It's memorable because someone hid behind it while the dragon flew overhead. Someone climbed it to scout the road. Someone carved their initials into the bark after surviving an impossible battle. Someone cast Speak with Plants and ended up having a conversation they absolutely weren't expecting. Terrain becomes a part of the story because people interact with it, not simply because it exists. So if you're thinking about getting into terrain painting, my advice is wonderfully simple. Start. Pick something that looks fun. Don't worry about whether it's perfect. Don't compare your first tree to someone else's 500th project. Every experienced miniature painter has an early creation tucked away somewhere that reminds them of how much they've learned. Those imperfect pieces aren't embarrassing. They're milestones. They're proof that progress happens one brushstroke at a time. And honestly, I think there's something pretty magical about that. As for this little tree, I think it's ready to find a home on somebody's tabletop. Maybe it'll become the centerpiece of an enchanted grove. Maybe it'll provide cover during a desperate battle. Maybe it'll simply stand quietly beside a forest path while a group of adventurers argues for 20 minutes about whether they should go left or right. If it's Dungeons and Dragons, they'll probably choose a third option that nobody saw coming. They always do, and I wouldn't have it any other way. That's part of the magic of this hobby. We paint the world, but the players bring it to life. That's about it for today. I'd love to hear about your favorite piece of tabletop terrain, whether it's something you've painted yourself, built from scratch, or an unforgettable location from one of your campaigns, so let me know down in the comments below. I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!